I have been obsessed with learning about the band Nirvana, and I wanted to talk about it. So come along with me on a journey from humble beginnings to tragic endings, and we're going to learn all about the band. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967 to Wendy Fraudenberg and Donald Cobain in Aberdeen, Washington. He was a happy and energetic child growing up, and it wasn't until he was about 9 years old when his parents divorced that a noticeable shift in his personality took place. He started to become more defiant and withdrawn, not doing very well in school. Kurt's behaviors got so bad that a few years after the divorce, he was living with his dad and stepmom, and they got into a big argument, resulting in Kurt needing to move out of the house and didn't really have a place to go. There's even been talk about the possibility that he slept underneath a bridge a few times, although most people are speculating whether or not that was actually true. Kurt dropped out of school after realizing that he didn't have enough credits to graduate and instead spent most of his time focused on his art and music. While in school, he did end up creating a band by the name of Fecal Matter and recorded a demo tape with a few songs on it. Could you imagine if he ended up keeping that name? One of the most famous bands of all time, instead of being called Nirvana, was Fecal Matter. I think it's best if we don't imagine a world where that name ended up sticking. Kurt became friends with a band by the name of the Melvins, who was mostly known for playing punk rock music. He would often join their jam sessions, and while there was another boy by the name of Chris Novoselic, who actually attended the same high school as Kurt. Kurt had asked Chris if he wanted to join his band as his bass player, and Chris had actually said no and wasn't really interested in joining his band with him. It wasn't until 3 years later that Chris ended up listening to one of Kurt's demo tapes and agreed to join in as his bass player. At this point, they decided to scrap the name Fecal Matter, which I think was a wise choice, and went through a few other names like Skid Row, Pencap Chew, and Ted Ed Fred. Eventually, they landed on the name Nirvana, which is a Buddhist concept that essentially is the end of suffering and a state of bliss. Kurt said that he wanted a name that was kind of beautiful or nice and pretty instead of mean and raunchy. In my opinion, this name, paired with the sound that the band created, is a perfect representation of the complexity that Kurt had. He had so much love and empathy for the world while also carrying around so much anger and hurt at the same time. Chris and Kurt eventually moved north to Olympia, Washington, and began practicing with Dale Crover from the Melvins. They recorded their first demo in January of 1988. Dale Crover ended up moving to San Francisco, but recommended a friend named Dave Foster to take his place as drummer. This didn't last very long since he ended up getting arrested and went to jail. So Kurt and Chris put an ad in the music publication The Rocket, hoping to see if anybody would want to join as their drummer. Unfortunately, this ended in them not finding anybody to join their band. Instead, they had a friend suggest Chad Channing to fill in as their drummer. So it was at this point that they started to gain popularity in the local area, playing at shows and parties, mostly within the college community. They got the attention of Jack Endino this way, and he ended up becoming their producer. It was through Jack that Sub Pop's Jonathan Poneman discovered Nirvana and signed them, making them the first band to have an extended contract with Sub Pop. By December of 1988, they released their first single, Love Buzz, which was a cover from the group Shocking Blue. The following month, they released their first official album, Bleach, which was inspired by the punk rock sound of Mudhoney and the Melvins combined with heavy metal. This specific sound is what we would now call grunge, which was a common label used for a lot of the bands in the Seattle area at the time. The entire album only cost around $600 to make and was released in June of 1989. Jonathan Everman was on the album as second guitarist and even toured with the band in support of the album, then later left to go join the group Soundgarden. Although I'm not sure if he's having any regrets about leaving Nirvana, but Soundgarden isn't a bad move either. In 1990, Nirvana began working on their next album with producer Butch Vig at Smart Studios. Issues were popping up with their drummer Chad Channing, so he ended up leaving the band due to creative differences. Then Dale Crover, being the good friend that he is, returned to be their drummer for their West Coast tour with Sonic Youth. Still needing a permanent solution for their drummer problem, Buzz Osborne from the Melvins was the one that introduced the band to Dave Grohl. Nirvana was already somewhat well known in the underground at this point, so Dave had actually already heard of the band and agreed to audition to be their drummer. It was actually really sweet because Dave has said that he called his mom in order to see what he should do and if he should audition for the band. Thank God for Dave Grohl's mom because she told him to go for it. Just a few minutes into the audition, audition, it was clear to Kurt and Chris that they were going to offer Dave the spot. Kurt had said that he had never seen anybody hit the drums quite as hard as Dave. And boy, was that a good time for Dave to join the band, because it was shortly thereafter that DGC Records signed Nirvana onto their label and they began recording their second album, Nevermind. None of them really loved how clean and polished the album ended up sounding, but it did go on to sell over 400,000 copies a week by December of 1991. Specifically, the song Smells Like Teen Spirit being heavily played on both the radio and on MTV, which is what skyrocketed them into fame. By the beginning of 1992, the song was on America's Top 10 and Nevermind was #1 on Billboard album charts. At this point, things were moving so quickly for the band, and I think that they were starting to become overwhelmed with the level of fame that they were receiving. They were making some interesting choices with their performances and how they would appear on talk shows, and I think that they were just trying to wrap their head around what was even happening to them at this time. There was a little bit of drama going on within the band because there was discussion regarding the split in royalties and Kurt seeking a larger split due to the fact that he was the one who mostly wrote the music. Originally, Dave and Chris were okay with this split, but then once they realized that Kurt was actually asking for this to be retroactive from the release of Nevermind, then they were having some problems. Personally, I do think that Kurt's reasoning was fair and he maybe should have gotten a larger cut, but the fact that he wanted it to be from the release of the album and how much he was asking for just didn't really make sense to me. It is kind of suspicious to me that he even was asking for this to begin with, because if you watch interviews with him, he doesn't really strike me as a greedy person or someone who cares all that much about money. Now, it did seem like he wanted to become a musician and that's what he wanted to do with his life and do it well enough to make a living, but I just think that there were people around his sphere that were trying to convince him that this was the cut that he deserved, and I think he just agreed with it because that's what people were telling him. By the end of it, Kurt did eventually get 75% of the royalties. It was around this time that Kurt started dating Courtney Love from the band Hole, and eventually she became pregnant with their first child. It was on August 18th, 1992 that Courtney gave birth to their daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, and I think it's adorable that her middle name is Bean due to the fact that Kurt thought that she looked like a little bean when she was a baby. It was in September of 1993 that their third and final album, In Utero, was recorded and released. It cost around $25,000 to make and took them about 2 weeks to record. You can definitely tell the difference in sound between this album and Nevermind, which I kind of like because you can hear the authenticity within this album since it sounds a little bit more gritty and has more distortion to it, and I think that this was the sound that the band had originally intended for Nevermind. The album still did quite well, reaching #1 on Billboard's Top 200 and selling 15 million copies worldwide. A month after the album's release, Nirvana went on tour for the first time in 2 years. Kurt's drug problem was already somewhat well known at this time, but it wasn't until July of 1993 that he overdosed for the first time, and Courtney had to inject him with naloxone in order to revive him. He then had another episode in March of 1994 while they were on their European tour, and he had to be rushed to the hospital while staying in Rome. The band ended up canceling the tour, and Kurt immediately went into rehab. He ended up not staying there very long and actually left the facility and returned to Seattle without telling anybody. Then on April 8th, 1994, the entire world changed when an electrician found Kurt in his home with a self-inflicted gunshot wound and a note expressing why he had chose to end his life. Now, there's been a lot of speculation throughout the years whether or not this was a conspiracy or if this actually was something that Kurt did himself. And I'm not going to go too much into it just because I think that there's a lot of information out there, and that's going to be for each individual person to look into and determine for themselves. I've seen the information, I watched the documentaries, I saw the film that the private investigator that Courtney hired put out, and even with all of that, I still don't think that the conspiracy is necessarily valid. I do think that this was Kurt's decision. I do think that he had untreated mental health issues, and do I think that there were people in his life who maybe didn't help his mental health or help his drug addiction? Yes, I don't think that people were necessarily pushing him in the right direction all the time, but I don't really agree with any of the theories out there that any one person was the cause of this other than Kurt Cobain himself. I'm just going to leave it at that and just say that this was a very sad situation, and it was the heartbreak that was felt around the world and showed the seriousness that mental health issues can cause. Following Kurt's death, the band did eventually break up, and Dave went on to create the band Foo Fighters, while Chris went on to do a few musical projects of his own and even got into political activism. Dave did invite Chris onto a few tracks and performances with Foo Fighters and even did several interviews together after the band broke up. There were some legal battles between Chris, Dave, and Courtney Love. Courtney wanted to get rid of the Nirvana LLC, stating that Kurt was Nirvana and that the the other 2 members were just sidemen. Dave and Chris did countersue against Courtney and asked for a different representative of Kurt's estate. A settlement was eventually reached before it did go to court. Ultimately, the band made a huge impact for the short period of time that it existed, and their image, songs, and overall branding is still very much so relevant in pop culture. I want to continue to make videos on different bands and music artists, so let me know what topic you would like me to cover next. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.